Why is every country in debt? Who does the world owe money to? When we look at the world from a distance, we might think of countries as completely independent economies. Every country has its own currency, banks, companies, and government. But once debt enters the picture, all of these countries become connected through an invisible financial network. The United States has debt. Japan has debt. European countries have debt. Developing countries have debt. Even countries that appear economically strong have debt. But this raises a very important question. If almost every country is in debt, who do these countries owe money to? And even more interestingly, if everyone in the world is in debt at the same time, who is the creditor? The answer is more complicated than you might think. Being in debt does not automatically mean that a country is bankrupt. Governments, unlike individuals or companies, do not necessarily have to pay off all their debt at once. Governments can continue borrowing, issue new bonds when old debts mature, and manage their debt as their economies grow. One of the most important concepts here is government bonds. When a government needs money, one way it can borrow from investors is by issuing bonds. An investor gives money to the government, and the government promises to repay that money, usually with interest after a certain period of time. But who buys these bonds? Banks, pension funds, investment funds, insurance companies, central banks, foreign governments, and millions of individual investors. So a country's debt is usually not owned by one single person or one single institution. Why do countries keep borrowing? There are many reasons. For example, a government may want to build a new highway, hospital, school, or railway system. Large projects can require huge amounts of money, and the government may not have all of that money available immediately. Instead of increasing taxes, the government may choose to borrow. Sometimes, however, borrowing happens because of an economic crisis. Companies become smaller, people's incomes fall, unemployment increases, tax revenues decrease, but government spending on healthcare, education, security, and other public services continues. This can create a gap between the government's income and its expenses. Borrowing is one way to fill that gap, but borrowing comes with a cost. Interest: the more a country borrows, and the more risky investors believe that country's debt is, the higher the cost of borrowing can become. That is why the amount of debt itself is not always the most important thing. What matters is the country's debt compared with the size of its economy, as well as the cost of servicing that debt. Is debt always bad? No. This is a common misunderstanding. Having a large amount of debt does not automatically mean that a country's economy is weak. Imagine there are two countries. The first country has $1 trillion of debt. The second country has $500 billion of debt. At first, it might seem like the second country is in a better position. But what if the first country's economy is worth $50 trillion, while the second country's economy is worth only $1 trillion? Now the situation looks completely different. That is why economists do not look only at the total amount of debt. They also compare debt with the size of the country's economy. This is known as the debt to GDP ratio. It helps us understand how much debt a country has compared with the economic output it produces. Who does the world owe money to? Now, let's return to our main question. Who does the world owe money to? The answer is, to a large extent, the world owes money to itself. Why? Because one person's or institution's debt is often another person's or institution's financial asset. For example, when a bank buys a government bond, that bond is an asset for the bank. But from the government's perspective, the same bond represents debt. So on one side there is a debt, and on the other side there is an asset. This means that a large part of the financial system consists of debts that appear as assets somewhere else in the system. At first, this may sound strange, but this is actually one of the basic mechanisms of the modern economy. One person's borrowing can become another person's investment. A company's debt can become an investor's asset. A government's bond can become an investment for a bank, fund, or individual. What role do banks play? Banks have a very important role in this system. Banks collect deposits from individuals and businesses and help create a system through which credit can flow throughout the economy. When someone deposits money in a bank, that money does not necessarily just sit in a vault. The banking system can use financial resources to provide loans and support economic activity. Because of this mechanism, businesses can invest, people can use loans for homes and other major expenses, companies can build new factories, and governments can borrow money from financial markets. However, for the system to work safely, debt needs to remain manageable, because as debt increases, interest payments can increase as well. And for some countries, this is where the real problem begins. When does debt become dangerous? Risk increases when a country's income becomes insufficient to comfortably manage its debt payments. For example, if a government has to make very large interest payments every year, it may have fewer resources available for education, healthcare, infrastructure, or other public services. Even worse, if investors lose confidence in the country, borrowing new money can become much more expensive. This can create a dangerous cycle. Higher interest rates, higher borrowing costs, a greater need for borrowing, and even more economic pressure. In some countries, this process can eventually lead to a serious economic crisis. Why can some countries print their own money? There is another important distinction here. Countries that have their own currency can increase the money supply when necessary, but that does not mean they can simply print unlimited amounts of money without consequences. If the amount of money in the economy increases much faster than the amount of goods and services being produced, prices can rise. In other words, printing money does not automatically create real wealth. Real economic strength comes from things such as production, technology, human resources, natural resources, investment, and productivity. That is why the monetary policies of central banks are extremely important for maintaining economic stability. Why do countries lend money to each other? Because different countries have different amounts of money and foreign currency reserves. Some countries earn large amounts of foreign currency through exports. Instead of simply keeping all of that money in cash, they can invest it in different financial assets. Government bonds are one of those assets. This means that one country can effectively invest in another country's debt. This creates a financial connection between countries. But there is another side to this connection. A major economic crisis in one country can affect other countries as well. That's because modern economies are deeply interconnected. How can a crisis in a small country affect the world? The answer lies partly in trade and financial connections. A bank in one country may owe money to a bank in another country. An investment fund may hold government bonds from several different countries. A company may depend on raw materials from another country to manufacture its products. Because of these connections, major economic problem in one country can spread to other economies over time. This is sometimes called financial contagion. That is why international organizations, central banks, and governments closely monitor major economic crises. So, what is the conclusion? The most important thing to understand about the world's debt system is this. Debt is not automatically good or bad. What matters is why the debt was taken, how quickly it is growing, what interest rate is being paid, and whether the country can manage that debt in the future. A country can borrow money to invest in its future. It can build new roads, improve its education system, invest in technology, and expand its economy. However, if debt is mainly being used to continuously cover current expenses, while the economy is not growing at a similar rate, serious problems can develop in the future. And perhaps the most interesting part of this entire story is this. Countries around the world can owe money to each other. Banks can lend money to governments. Investors can purchase government bonds. Governments can hold financial assets from other countries. In other words, the global economy is like a giant financial network connecting billions of people and institutions. On one side, there is debt. On the other side, there is an asset. On one side, there is spending. On the other side, there is investment. And one of the most important things keeping this entire system functioning is trust. Because when people and institutions stop believing that they will be able to get their money back in the future, the entire financial system can become much more fragile. That's why the real question isn't simply, how much debt does the world have? The more important question is, how sustainable is that debt? Because the size of the debt alone does not tell the whole story. The real story lies behind the debt. The economy, production, interest rates, investor confidence, and expectations for future economic growth. And because the global economy is more interconnected than ever before, an economic decision made by one country can sometimes affect another country thousands of kilometers away. That is why the global debt system is not just about governments. It includes banks, companies, investors, and ordinary people as well. So, what do you think? If countries completely eliminated their debt, would the global economy really become a better place? Or is debt an unavoidable part of the modern economy? Let us know what you think in the comments.